Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thank you for staying with us. We welcome your contributions and we'll sample the feedback in the course of this broadcast. Reverend, coming to you. How much of influence do you think you had as the men of God, given the President's concession on the Finance Bill 2024, which was largely the reason as to why all these demonstrations across the country are witnessed from the Gen Zs?
Well, I think the story starts last year, the last financial year, because when Kenya Kwanza government came into power and they brought out the better agenda, they came up with their first budget. And the finance bill was a disaster. It was bizarre to see an administration that was coming to build the economy bottom up, taxing things that ought not to have been taxed before. We saw the subsidies on fuel being removed, but not being replaced by anything, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we opposed strongly the finance bill of 2023. And it's there on record. We went as far as talking to the president and everybody else who could listen to us. So when the finance bill for this year was published, we had a meeting sometimes in May as the executive committee, more than 200 clergy across the country. And all of them, the outcry was that this bill is oppressive. Mm-hmm. The taxation is too much, we can't bear. And the message was, what do we do? Because we had tried to talk through the finance committee and no changes were made, we decided that this time round, let the pastors talk to the MPs, because the MPs actually have the power of the purse. Although we know that Parliament has become so illegitimate that even the power of the purse, they have handed it over to State House. So we were very clear to MPs that you must, this time round, redeem your legitimacy. And pastors started talking to MPs all over the country. And this actually, we are not saying we are the ones who started it off, but we were very happy when the Gen Zs and the young people in this country also took it up, to talk to the MPs, to call them, to SMS, and so on and so forth. And we issued several statements around the finance bill. And we were very clear. Let us reject the finance bill. We asked our church leaders to actually preach from the pulpit against the finance bill and to ask for its rejection by members of Parliament. However, this was not heeded, and that is why Kenyans cannot understand how incapable their members of Parliament are to listen to them. And some of them who are press said they are listening from other quarters. So we have tried our best and we have done our best. So when that came to be, last week we had an executive committee of the National Council of Churches of Kenya. And we realized that if the president signs, because Parliament had already passed the bill into law, now our only hope was the president, that the president will have the wisdom not to sign. So we issued a statement as the interfaith on Monday, and we said reject the finance bill. And then on Tuesday, there was the storming of Parliament, which I think is symbolic, because the people are saying, under Article 1, we are the sovereign. We have given you a mandate to represent us, and we have told you to reject the finance bill. Now you are passing it under our faces. We are coming to take away your power. And symbolically, they took away the mace. So in my view, and in the view of many of the church leaders that I've spoken to, they are saying the people who actually went to State House, not to State House, but to Parliament, and took the mace, regained their power. And therefore, when we went to, on Wednesday, was D-Day. If the president was to sign that bill, then there was actually a threat to storm State House in a Sri Lanka style. And we felt that if that was to happen, it could result in many things that we cannot even estimate. And that is why we pushed and we asked the president for a meeting, and we had a meeting. And we impressed on him, although by that time he had already issued a statement that rejection is the best way to go. Okay. So that's where we are.
Okay. Reverend, when you talk about parliamentarians failing in their duty, the bicameral setup where our members sit, the members are cut from us, the society. On one end also, you can't delink the failure on the part of civic responsibility of the public, is it? Because the 416 bicameral members are representing us, the people of Kenya. So it's also, in a way, not taking that civic responsibility as serious as it ought to be in electing leaders with integrity, one, leaders who take the three key responsibilities any lawmaker has across the world seriously, and those who think independently and always support the public's cause. It wouldn't have gotten to the point of invoking Article 1, which wherein all sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya, had we, the Kenyan people, put in place proper representation, is it?
I don't think that it is fair, either theologically or philosophical, or even in legal terms, to blame the voters. Voters are victims. They are victims of a colonial state that is extractive, that is oppressive. We have not managed to create a system that is for the people. And that although we have the new constitution, we haven't breathed enough life into it to make it people-driven and people-centered. And this is what I have to say about the members of parliament. They were elected by the people. Every one of us elected a member of parliament. And the people were speaking so loudly, whether it is on social media, on physical meetings, and we saw a very robust public participation. So for members of parliament to actually say no to the people who voted them, to the voters, that actually is the worst claim that a member of parliament can make, because that actually is going against the will of the people. So the blame lies squarely on parliament, collectively and individually as members.
Mm-hmm. Okay, coming to you, Franklin, given one of the key issues that the head of state yesterday was hard-pressed on, included the kidnappings and deaths, abductions, where he pledged when he came to power, and even before that, that this culture will end in this country. But it appears that there is continuity rather than change to that effect. I mean, when will the leadership of our country understand the principles of good governance and constitutionalism? Because there seems to be no moral change when it comes to the abductions that are happening, as they did happen in the previous administration, where the rights of Kenyans were violated.
Yep, I agree, Ayub, that we have a combination of both moral and the leadership crisis in this country. It is morally wrong for citizens to behave in a particular manner. If you look at the misnomer that we have in our social contract, it's purely because of some poor political culture that we have. And I've complained that a lot in terms of how we treat our leaders as not representatives, not as people who should do specific work, but we have turned them into the social welfare dispensation. If you look at the Damascus moment that the church is in today, it's because this flaunting opulence has been allowed to be on the pulpit, that politicians have taken the shortcut of taking over, very important services to politicize it. And that's where the complaints are coming in. On the part of the leaders, it is a lack of its inept leadership when parliamentarians who the law envisions independence of institutions, but then the institution of parliament has allowed the executive overreach and basically neutered it, that they can do the executive bidding as opposed to what the citizens want. The third issue I want to point out is the continuous denigration of institutions. And if you have followed the culture of this regime, is that when there is a disagreement in terms of views of how things should happen, you hear very unpalatable comments going directed at specific institutions, and with the exception of Parliament, which is very much a strange bedfellow of the executive. If you look at the way the president, for instance, spoke about the judiciary, you know, and how those how the courts would behave. It was not a conversation that's well settled with Kenyans. If you listen to his comments yesterday about a very important constitutional commission like the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and dismissing their information as deep fakes, I think we are not being fair to the institution. So as we seek, even as he tells Kenyans that any other route, young people are saying Ruto must go because of the level of dishonesty and the lack of trust that they have with his regime. I agree with him that the contrary way is to anarchy. But what are we doing in terms of protecting and strengthening the institutions that we bestowed ourselves? We've broken all that is to be broken in terms of the legal, policy, and constitutional demands in terms of establishing the IEBC. And if we were to fall in a crisis in this country, it's a proper anarchy, because how do you even pursue the issue of recalling members of parliament? How do you even pursue, if there was need actually, that there was total lack of trust in this regime and the president had to step down? How do we even go back to doing elections? With this kind of comments, I think it's important that we really ask ourselves, how do we safeguard what we have, and how do we build on those so that we can be able to properly safeguard our country?
But if you look at the architecture and the framework of Katiba 2010, it appears that the culture anticipated under our current constitutional order seems to be living way, I mean, it's more or less the culture, the constitutional culture is way ahead of the participant within that framework, and they seem unable to cope up, given the institutional framework that it came with, the vast array of institutions that ought to be functioning in a way that champions the interest of the common mwananchi. When will that culture be appreciated by the players that we have in the political ecosystem?
I think it's a progressive thing. Someone quipped that culture is more stable than the law. And it's a progressive thing that we have to continually see that we're breathing life, the spirit and letter of our constitution. However, there is an aspect that we have to realize, that politicians, as a country, we didn't just go wrong the other day. We started wrong. If you look at the way, and you mentioned the architecture of the new constitution, if you look at just picking the issue of devolution, for instance, when it came to harmonizing the centralized system, the devolved system, we opted for the shortcut and not be able to pursue. And the challenges that we have today is that a lot of money is absorbed in the huge public service that we have around devolution and the provincial administration that was left intact and not remodeled or done away with the way the new constitution envisaged. So we have taken quite a bit of shortcuts that we have not been really strict to what the constitution provides, but this kind of discussion is what enables us to move closer and closer. There are institutions that have been well developed around because of the 2010 constitution. What we need to drop are the aspects that we have really kept ourselves rotating around when we needed to. So we need to have a conversation on what kind of devolved governance did we envisage? What have we done that is contrary to it? The president himself in his campaign promised to look into devolved functions and make sure that those, but we cannot do that at the same time sticking, and I had the president again referring to the National Government Constitutional Development Fund, something that we clearly are aware that it's illegal, that the Supreme Court has actually given an advisory on. Why are we not sticking to the way we asked to do our things and introducing new things that are convenient? Yes. Because you want politicians to have money to interface and be able to pursue your politics instead of the real things that Kenyans envisage. So we have to really transition from that. And it will take a bit of time. It's progressive, but it's important that we continue pressing and continuing to challenge those issues.
Yes, Advocate Kamadho.
Yes, I was just going to say, first, let me, for one of the few times I would disagree with the General Secretary. I think we need to be careful about telling Kenyans that they are victims. I think if there's anything the last 2 weeks have taught us, is that Kenyans are not victims. And I think there's a level of civic responsibilities that Kenyans need to own as part of the problem we have today. I have been involved in campaigns for many years. I was involved in campaigns in 1997. I was involved in the campaigns last year. It's a very different Kenyan. In 1997, we discussed issues. We went round. I was never asked for money once. In the elections 2022, you could not go anywhere and people are not asking for money. Now, we can say it's victims, people are struggling, but I'm just saying that there's a point at which Kenyans must also rise up and take the constitutional, if we're talking about the sovereignty of the people, that responsibility of the sovereignty is a big responsibility. And so Kenyans must also now say, when we go to 2022, what sort of leaders are we going to be electing? Or are we going to elect people and then sit back and say, oh, look how horrible they are? Mm-hmm. So there's a sense in which there's a need to de-victimize the voter. The young people have taught us that we are not victims. The other thing I want to say is that it has taken a very long to build institutions in this country. We have a strong judiciary. You see also it's important that we celebrate. At a time like this, it's very possible to just see the wrong and what is bad. But it's important to celebrate great institutions that we have. We have a judiciary that is about one of the best in the world, if not in the continent, if not in the world. Mm-hmm. We have a parliament that is institutionalized in terms of our lawmaking processes, in terms of our budget-making processes. So we can cure the defects that are there, but we need to retain the institutional strength that we have. What we have said in parliament through the last 2 weeks is, whatever decisions I make as a member of parliament, there is personal responsibility. And so I must ask myself, even if I make a decision that is against people's wishes, because sometimes as a leader, it's not always that you make decisions that people agree with, but you need to know that what you're doing is good for the people. If you can take that personal responsibility, I hope that is what we have learned for the last week. In terms of the executive, yes, the same thing. What we are saying is that the executive needs to recognize now that once it is elected, it is not a carte blanche for 5 years. It has a responsibility from day one to keep speaking. The conversations that we are having today should have been had 6 months ago before we ended up in a crisis. So what I'm saying is that we can reform our systems, and we can reform within the boundaries of the Constitution. And therefore, even to the young people to say, they have shown us that civic responsibility can have an effect. Even that needs to be exercised within fair constitutional boundaries. Because if we don't do that, the change that is sustainable, the change that is gradual and it is done within rules, it is very easy to bring down a country. Yeah. I think to the extent that we have a constitutional framework within which we can negotiate, within which we can look at Kenya's. If we get to the point where that fails, then maybe we can discuss other options. But we are so far away from there. And what we need to do is let us look at the options that are there. And those options must first and foremost include listening. I was looking at the framework that was proposed by the head of public service. Mm-hmm. And from where I sit, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that framework. The problem is that framework comes from a position of we know what structure should be there. And this is the structure. I would have said, sit back and ask the people, because there are people who are offended. Ask them, how would you like us to talk with each other? Let them be the ones who drive the question of structure. Because it doesn't matter how good your structure is. If people don't believe that they are a part of defining that process, it doesn't matter what conversations you have. So I would not have rushed to design, call people representation. That is neither here nor there, unless it comes from the people who are offended. Number two, in the last 2 weeks, I would actually, in the X spaces by now, members of cabinet should be there daily, every time, because those things happen every night, sometimes for 5-6 hours. I've sat in some of them. Members of cabinet, without necessarily even being asked, they should have been sitting in those groups and not necessarily talking, but just saying we're here to listen. It's going to be unpalatable. Some of it is not very nice the way it is said, but these are your constituencies. You don't even need a framework. Even as we talk about which is the framework, even by now, that should have been happening. And finally, there are certain things we need to do today. There are certain things that you don't even need a conversation before you do. And those things need to be done immediately, because what those things do is that they start to create a sense of trust. Because what we have lost fundamentally is not solutions. It is trust. If we can, the way to regain that is there are certain difficult decisions that need to be made.
Yeah.
Some of them are going to be painful, but they are necessary to send the message that we have heard you. Then we can then create the environment where we can then talk. Until that happens, any other conversation, however good it is not going to move us forward.
But given the two key points, Advocate Kamodo, I'll come to the constitutionality aspect, institutions, and the beauty of their independence in a constitutional democracy like ours. But first, let me come to the trust aspect. Here you have the president who yesterday said he's even willing to be on those X spaces. Whatever the platform, whatever the choice of theater, he's willing to be part of the conversation. But the challenge is, if you look at the conduct on the other side of the equation, is that Kenyans are being abducted against, what the rule of law dictates. Kidnappings that the government has not provided explanations for. When he was hard-pressed yesterday, he appreciated and he said, he acknowledges that the former MP was arrested, Alfred Keter's case yesterday, but look at the manner in which they're happening. As a former member of the Constitutional Implementation Committee, no police identification, number plates that are not originally in the database of the National Transport and Safety Authority, no police number on their display part of their jackets or the T-shirts. If this can happen within the context of our constitutional democracy, then the Gen Zs have a legitimate concern is it when they say that, look, Mr. President, you have no moral authority on this.
Listen, Ayub, the truth of the matter is we have a police and security culture that we inherited right from our colonial days that has not changed fundamentally. And when I talk about some of the things that need to happen immediately, some of those things are so important in terms of the message that they send. Because it is possible to do all those arrests in a more humane manner. Because, this is Kenya. And people, this sort of environments, maybe there are times when that is called for. But at a time like now, when there is such legitimate anger, particularly in relation to the number of people that died, under police bullets during the protests, some, of course, and I'm one of those. I've been in protests before. I know that protests are hijacked. Protests are infiltrated. So I do know that happens. But in the context of that, whether in the crossfire, in whichever way, people lost their lives. In that context, this is the time to step out and show a different face of our security services. It is very, very important because what it sends a message is that we have heard you, and this is a different route we are taking. And some of those things that we have done so automatically, particularly in terms of the use of the security services, that if the security services are going to use excessive force, it is in circumstances that objectively are rational. But it cannot be that even when people are driving, from church, they are being arrested in that sort of manner. It doesn't send a message that we are moving in a different direction. And I understand there's a place to be arrested if you have received summons. I don't know. But I think we must send this message, especially in the context that we are in, that we're going to do things differently at all levels, including in the way we use our security service. Okay,
yes, Reverend.
It's the same thing. I think we all know that most of the people in government now there was a lot of mistreatment in the last regime. A lot of arrest on Friday and then not being presented in court within the hours. And because, our constitution talks about 24 hours, you arrest somebody on Friday so that then you'll have 48 hours, basically, for the courts to open. Not that the courts can't open on Saturday or Sunday, for that matter. So what we are seeing are desperate measures. When the state becomes illegitimate, when the people fall back and say, we don't trust you, that is when you see this kind of extrajudicial killings, the kidnappings, and the abductions. The reports that we are getting is like about 49 people have been abducted in this manner, arrested in this manner. They are not booked in real police stations which are gazetted. There are no arrest warrants. They are not charged in court within 24 hours. And they don't have access to their lawyers and so on. This is very, very widespread violation of the constitutions of the people of Kenya. And this is something that the president himself and his campaign team promised Kenyans that it will not happen.
And it seems a culture, because if you look back at some of the violations, court orders that were issued, that were not adhered to, even in the past government, it appears a carryover culture even into this administration. Therefore, how can it end? Because advocate says, going forward, we need to address the trust deficit and have the proper prescription of our problems, because we have had past talks, but they have not addressed the underlying problems that have been the common denominator. If you look at all the talks that have happened in the past and largely dominated by the political establishment. But going forward with this trust deficit then, how can we move forward? Because it seems we have some of the issues that have not been substantively addressed.
One of the things is that Kenyans are speaking now, and they are telling the government, we don't want this kind of abductions, we don't want this kind of treatment of people who have a contrary opinion. People must vibrantly and robustly be able to criticize their government, to come out and demonstrate. And if they demonstrate peacefully, they should not be harmed, they should actually be protected by the police. And for us to build back the trust that the state has lost, there are three things that we need to do. One is the public participation. And I talk about that because it is becoming like that is the real deal. People feel that the public participation, for example, around the finance bill was tokenism. You just come for photo ops, but there's no inclusion and there's no integration of the ideas. That kind of a thing this should be the last time that it happens. But people will trust an institution that values their contribution. We also need consistency. For example, if the law says that you arrest, for example, let's say for Alfred Katel, he's a former member of parliament. He's an honorable member. What was so difficult in him being summoned on Monday at DCI? Why did the police find it so important for him to be arrested when he is with his family? This is the kind of thing that we need to actually call out and bring it to an end. And I think the police that did this need to be held to account. What we need to see is not just people saying, or within government saying, okay, it was bad for him to be arrested in the manner that it was done. We need accountability. We need IPOA. And I think IPOA has been very quiet during this period. I have no clue whether we need IPOA that is quiet when the rights of Kenyans are being suppressed by the police action. And the third one is clarity. I think it needs to be absolutely clear what the president means, what the police means, and what parliament means, and what their plan is. When it comes to extrajudicial killings, we have a lot of reports which we have not verified that they are happening now. And I think we are going to speak to that in the near future. But I think this is, as Kamotho has said, this is not the right time for us to hear that some people are disappearing, for parents to be going from police station to police station. There is no way the police can act wrong. If they have arrested someone, let them go and book them into the nearest police station so that the parents know where to go, the lawyers know where to go. But this idea of people going to morgues to look for their children, it is backward. It is something that we were promised will never happen and should never happen going forward.
Franklin, what then do you think can cool the nerves of the Gen Zs who are determined to continue with their protest? Yesterday they held a vigil, and we expect their timelines of events to be also revealed. They had one for this week, last week. But this administration promised to end extrajudicial killings and abductions. The head of state is on record, 4th of January 2023, his first media engagement since he was elected as the president. And he said the reason as to why he fired Kinoti, the former DCI boss, is because of what had happened to Kenyans and the subsequent disbandment of the SSU, some still undergoing trials in courts of law. It seems that that culture is continuing. Vehicles without number plates, they knock on Advocate Waiganjo's home or Reverend Cannon or yours. No identification numbers, brandishing their assault rifles, taking you to police stations where you are not booked according to account details we have of Kenyans who have been abducted. And it seems that our political class and the leadership in the country is not coming to the talks that they have proposed with clean hands, given the circumstances that we have witnessed in the past 1 week.
I think the beginning point is that action now has to follow words. We have a very outspoken head of state, and what has irked the younger people is that there is no action that is following his very many words. What should be done? I think young people should be left to enjoy their inalienable constitutional rights. They have demonstrated, and in the words of His Excellency the President himself, is that the Gen Z's protests were infiltrated. It is not the responsibility of the young Kenyans to find the criminals that the President is referring to, who infiltrated and went on a rampage, destroying property and such. And the President should be also clear, was his police service overrun? Or did they were they not well facilitated, or are they, just not excited about the work they should be able to do? So that we can be able to separate the criminals from Kenyans that the President agrees with, that they have stepped up, they need to exercise their democratic rights. Follow that up with clear actions on the demands that they're asking. It is not enough for the President to tell us that he's soul-searching. It has been way too long for this cabinet, when they cannot be able to support him, when they cannot be able to offer guidance and be able to lead where leadership is required. But majority of them, in the eyes of the young Kenyans and majority of Kenyans, they are interested in deals. Then the President should move beyond just saying, I'm soul-searching, to actually cracking the whip. And those actions following words are the ones that are going to demonstrate, including what I mentioned earlier. Yeah. You cannot be calling dialogue with Kenyans when there's been a plethora of previous dialogues whose reports have not been implemented. We have 2 years into after elections and edging closer every day to the next election. These issues needs to be discussed. When you want young people to engage, please even also get them to prepare for the next election. Those things should be really, really addressed. And these are the things that young people are really asking, that can you act where you need to act? You need to be able to respond to the calls that they are talking about. And the clarity of these issues, Kenyans look at the finance bill largely as a trigger. And why they do not want to have that clear conversation was that they thought that the issues that the President and the parliamentary committee of his party addressed were a decoy to the real issues that were underlying the finance bill. So if we can be able to follow action with the words that have now been become the order of the day, and Kenyans are not seeing any difference. You talk about peaceful demonstration. Young people come only armed with the water bottles, and then you say that the protests have been infiltrated. You have the capacity and the means to tell us clearly who infiltrated this. You tell us you want dialogue, let us see it beginning at the very highest level between you and your deputy, and not speaking at cross purposes. On one day, the deputy talks about the lack of sufficient intelligence brief to the President to make sure that he understands the feelings of Kenyans and would have averted this. The following day, we hear the President saying, I was well briefed that there are criminals who infiltrated this. So if the conversation has to begin, let there be proper honesty, let there be, that following up of the action with the words. Otherwise, it's paying lip service and young people can see through it, and they will not continue trusting words merely because the President has said it. Yeah. Young people want that those words are acted upon.
And Advocate, does our constitutional architecture and the fact that there is a security of tenure for the Deputy President, unlike in the past where there was unceremonious and willy-nilly dismissal of vice presidents by former regime leaders, and largely Kenyatta and Moi, is the current dispensation, or has it birthed deputy presidents who know that because of the security tenure are largely prompting or are leading to dysfunctional presidencies? If you look at the Deputy President Ruto during Uhuru presidency, and now it's the first time of the Ruto administration, and it seems that him and Gachagua in many aspects are reading from different hymn sheets.
The challenge of every constitution is that a constitution also is accompanied by a culture. Now, we borrowed a constitutional framework that presumes certain cultures. And we have not followed those cultures. In places which have presidential systems, and go around the world, the sort of structure that we have borrowed of a sort of an assistant president, it is very rare that you find, and it happens, it is very rare that you find the president and their deputy going in fundamentally different routes. And especially when those different routes are not issues of fundamental principle, but are fundamental issues of politics. And I think where we have reached is that we need to ask the question, if you look at the way the deputy president constitutionally is not even given any functions by the constitution. Their role is purely to be the assistant to the president and to be and to perform those duties that they're allocated. What is then presumed by the Constitution?
Yeah.
Does the Constitution presume a shared presidency, or does the Constitution presume a unitary president with a support system? I think because of the nature of our politics, and because our politics are about politics of alliances, what has happened is that we have understood the presidency, the vice presidency, as the latter, as if it's a co-presidency. And I think the problem with that is that in a country that is going through a very difficult, and let me tell you, Ayub, our country has complex problems. Anybody who tells you that we're going to waive a ward, remove finance bill or have it there and solve this country's problems, is living in naivety land. This country has complex problems. In that situation, you do not want a situation where the leadership is talking from different perspectives. It doesn't help. And especially when it is clear that what people are doing is investing for the future, as opposed to really honestly resolving the problems. Let me give you an example. Yeah. If you were to look at the allocations in the budget, because sometimes we rush to the finance bill,
yes,
and not look at the budget from which those things emanate. I have no problem with the deputy president issuing the statements he's saying. But some of the most annoying allocations that annoyed Kenyans emanated from that office. I'd have wanted the deputy president at that point to have said, by the way, for me, I don't want 800 billion shillings in confidential expenditure. You know what I mean? And that's what I mean about trust. Then you gain the credibility when the crisis happens to come and tell the country, my boss has a problem. We needed to have seen that at the point at which you are part of the trough. But it is not fair. It's actually an insult to Kenyan's intelligence to now come with the solution to a problem which you are part of creating. And I think that has been the problem of our political culture. And I think we need to then decide what sort of political system we have that guarantees us unity at the top, because we need unity at the top if we're going to be able to govern a very difficult, the country in very different circumstances. We do not want our leaders to appear to be trying to harvest from a crisis, because that is a problem. You want to harvest from a crisis, but that is unfortunate. That is where we're losing trust. Yeah,
and largely that seems to be a common aspect when it comes to the culture of our politicians. If you look at the makeup of the current cabinet and leadership in terms of both houses of parliament, following the Supreme Court nullification of President Kenyatta's re-election in 2017, the leadership in the country called the top court in the country a network of wakoras, which was very unfortunate. It's a language that's cascading down, and its effect felt to Wakili, given what also Ndindi Nyoro said. He urged then President Uhuru Kenyatta to suspend Katiba as a whole. The current defense CS, when he was the majority leader, he called out a judge, name of High Court judge, simply because of coming from certain community, and that his determinations and decisions in court were largely in supportive of the opposition coalition for reforms and democracy then. And that seems to be a carryover culture into this administration, where we have seen the new year this year beginning with an assault on the third arm of the government by the president himself. And then that also carried on by other leaders who called judges names and largely character assassinated the third arm of the government. How can we resolve this generational leadership crisis that we have that doesn't seem to appreciate the context of a constitutional framework that we have and rather focus on education, healthcare, and a working infrastructure?
You know, when we talked about the fact that this is a moment that requires deep reflection, I am hoping that there's a message that this has sent. Because you see, traditionally, the problems with this country have been very easy to diagnose, or at least, you know, in terms of to manage. Because whether it's our protest movement, they've been very easy and very predictable. This is a new one. Mm-hmm. This is a new one because I don't think anyone would have predicted that it would be where it is. What I hope it does is that it forces us, it gives us an opportunity to ask some very fundamental questions. My own conviction, for example, part of why the young people have come out in these numbers is the absence of alternative institutions. You see, in our process of creating a strong government, we forgot that every system requires alternative voices. When people sense that we don't have a strong opposition, for whatever reason, mm-hmm. because it's been compromised, it's too busy trying to prepare for space in government. When the parliament itself is not operating, when civil society has been compromised, when the church, in many instances, also appears to be, when people sense there is no alternative voices, then you expect the sort of uprising that you are having. Every government needs to actually work very hard mm-hmm. to ensure that you have institutions, even institutions that challenge you. Because that constitutional framework is what enables. You don't want to push people to the point where they have no other spaces to go. And that is the context in which a lot of these delegitimization of institutions have been happening. Mm-hmm. When you delegitimize the judiciary, people forget that when you are out of power, that is the institution that will come to your aid. When you misuse the security forces and arrest people on the wrong days, don't forget that in another so many years, one will be out of power. Those same institutions, is very possible that they can be. So it is very, very important for investments for the future that we recognize that we all benefit when our institutions are strong. And by the way, that talks even to the young people. They need to recognize also that these institutions sometimes that we might bastardize, you know, these institutions are going to be important in the future. There is no problem with Kenya's presidency as an institution. And we need to protect that institution of the presidency. There is no fundamental problem with the institution called parliament. We need to protect the institution of parliament. Are there certain things we need to do to ensure that those people are more responsible mm-hmm. and accountable to the citizen? Yes. But that might not start by saying, let us destroy these institutions. Those institutions are so critical to the future sustainability of this country as a nation. We play the ball, not the men. Therefore, focus on the holders, not the institutions.
Thank you.
Yes, Reverend.
I think I wanted to add to that point that if you look at, let me start with the institution of the Deputy President. From independence, we have had challenges, or there has been political challenges with Deputy Presidents, whether it was Jaramogi or Murumbi or all the others that came after. There are those who stayed longer. And I think President Moi was one of those who stayed much, much longer. And now we said we want to create a constitution that, you know, provide a security of tenure for the Deputy President so that the Deputy President is not sacked when the President is buying sukuma wiki at Sokomjinga. You know that used to happen before. So we have the President who was Deputy President before, whose seat was secured by that. And we saw what happened in the last 5 years. And now we have the current issue, which I think we are still studying it, especially for us in the religious sector, to see how we can help. But I think there is nothing fundamentally wrong with the Constitution. I think, as we have said here, the culture has to change. We have to breathe life into the new constitutional structures as we move forward. Now, the second problem that we have right now, which is why the Gen Z have no trust, or citizens of Kenya have no trust in this government, is that when they came to power, they have consolidated a lot of power. We have seen the consolidation of power where Parliament has become an appendage, and as Gen Z are saying, a puppet of the State House, and that has been The evidence of that is the passing of the finance bill. Then we have the judiciary. There was an attempt, a very spirited attempt of the executive to also subjugate the judiciary. And we allowed the judiciary because they fought back. And partly also because I think we do have a long history and some of the judges have that kind of history in mind. It is wrong for any arm of government to subjugate another because this works like a system, almost like a system that if, for example, in your house, your window is open when it's raining, rain is going to come in, or wind is going to come in, or other intruders are going to come in. So the system must work together. We have seen the police, and I think that yesterday the president talked in all terms to say that he has made the police independent. But Kenyans don't feel that way. Kenyans feel that the police are being given orders to shoot with live ammunition on protesters who are unarmed. That is something that does not happen in a democracy. So all the institutions must be able to function properly. And for whoever is in power, like now, they have to make sure that all the institutions are working, not just in government, but also the institutions like the religious sector is working together. And we take the criticism that we are getting from the young people very, very seriously. And as the National Council of Churches, we have actually come up with guidelines. I hope it will form part of this conversation.
And what are your demands? What are your irreducible minimums during that talks that the president had called for?
Are you talking about the talks that we had?
The multi-stakeholder forum.
Let me start by saying that the demands that we had on the president when we met him on Wednesday, one was for him to reject the finance bill.
That's done.
That's done. The other one was to withdraw the KDF from the streets. We actually...
He says my police officers are overwhelmed.
Yes, that's also what he was explaining to us. But we feel...
Did you then ask if that was the justification that he gave, that the police were overwhelmed, then what was the point of deploying our police officers to Haiti?
Now, I don't want to go to Haiti, but let's first of all finish the domestic affairs. The first thing is that the protests that are in the streets, in my view, even for the young people who went to Parliament, I don't think that it was an insurrection or something that would justify the deployment of the military. And that is what we were able to discuss with the president. And we still believe, and that is our firm appeal, that the deployment of KDF in the whole country indefinitely without an end date, it is against the Constitution of Kenya. And I think it is something that we shouldn't, the government should not use the police and the military to solve political problems. That for us is the message that we took and we continue to take. And that is the choice that we have to make as Kenyans. We have seen Sudan, where the civil society and the people came and pushed the government up to the President Omar al-Bashir, and he gave way. And after he gave way, there was an interim government headed by Hamdok for a time. Then there was a disagreement, and Hamdok was kicked off. And then the army took over. And then the army also fell apart. And now we have two sides of the army that are now fighting in Sudan, and Sudan is now a country that we need to pray that it comes together again. And
it's because of failure to reason and sit together, as Advocate Kamoda mentioned.
Yes, to listen. And it is better off, and I think this can make me unpopular. It is better for us, for our country to have a dictator than to be run or governed by the military. I mean, we are seeing what is happening in the Sahel. So for Kenyans, it is a sober discussion for us to pull back and say, how can we actually enunciate systemic change in the country without necessarily going the Sudan way, without us going the Somali way, and other countries around us that have given us...
But Canon, you appreciate both ends, before I go to Franklin, are disastrous in terms of decision-making. I mean, in our context then, if to go by your submissions, having a dictator, first, the architecture does not... I mean, there's no perfect fitting into our current architecture because in our case, the president has no prosecutorial powers. In our case, power does not absolutely belong to the president because some aspects have been devolved. But I mean, and we have never been militaristic in terms of our authority and the governing of our country. Can we then just get the right people amongst ourselves? And this comes to the point I earlier queried you on, is that we, the Kenyan people, are lying every given time on the very same bed that we make out of the electoral process. Look, after every 5 years, we go to the electoral polls. That is a guaranteed constitutional right to go and give the mandate to people whom we deem have integrity, listen to the people, can represent us, and are voices of the people. But we fail as also electorate on our part. So without going into your proposition of a dictator or even not foreseeing a militaristic authority, why not just make the correct democratic decision at the ballot? And is that the failure of a civic responsibility as to why we are today complaining about an overshoot budget, where we have the first lady and the second given allocations, houses are renovated at a cost that is more than even what was constructed in the first place. You have an overblown expenditure, 4.11 billion Kenya shillings spent the first 9 months according to the control of budget, and you have a parliament that is not listening to the people. Why not just make the correct civic decision at the ballot?
Well, power corrupts. Power corrupts. And I think, on one hand, the members of public and the voters actually make a decision on who to vote. And I think we all know what happens during campaigns. People spend quite huge sums of money that they want to recoup when they get into office. So I think the cost of democracy and the cost of election is too high for candidates who participate, especially even those who lose, because those who lose are actually more than those who win. But that being the case in a democracy, then those who go into office then must be held to account when they are in office. And that is why Kenyans are rising up and saying, our members of parliament are not listening to us, reject the finance bill, and so on and so forth. The second issue that I think is much, much more critical is to say that all institutions that have been put in place must work. Institutions, for example, that have not been put in law, like the First Lady, the Second Lady, the Prime Cabinet Secretary's position, which is not even properly constituted in law, those ones must go, and they should not even be budgeted. So what we are seeing is impunity. And that impunity is what Kenyans are calling out and saying, this should not happen, and should not happen going forward. And that means also, we have also to look at the budgeted corruption that is in the budget itself, in the sense that
Thank you.
We have a narrative in the country that we lose 30% of the budget to corruption.
Not that a narrative. From credible sources, we lose a third of our budget. If we trace back all this down to 2002, the statements by the now Kisumu County Governor Anyang' Nyong'o, Professor, the heads of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, the Judiciary, that is the Chief Justice Emeritus David Kinani Maraga, and also the control of budget herself, who says that my salary is triple, yet I am the only state official in that capacity. Right. Yes, Franklin, before we sample the feedback.
I would want this morning to speak to my president, that looking at where the country is, there are clearer issues that Kenyans have looked at your regime, and they would want him to look straight in their eye and address. The issue of trust deficit is squarely at his feet. There's been a lot of dishonest at the very top leadership. Kenyans cannot be able to separate fact from fiction, and that culture has to end. He should embrace more empathy as a leader. Speaking to economic losses, that is fine. Speaking to the brutal force to make sure that others are protected, that is fine. But having that feeling of empathy with those that have lost life, whose children have been shot and they are still desperate, is a very key thing. He must be very practical, very pragmatic, ruthless at it in terms of making sure that this flaunting opulence, this budgeted corruption that the good reverend from NC's case is complaining about, we must see practical steps to do it. There is no reason you can see a presidential convoy of millions of shillings and still millions of shillings are allocated, and then we need to see a step back on this. And finally, to His Excellency, is that prior to 2022, his believability levels were good because if you look at the struggle that Kenya has gone through, he actually epitomizes that he has had his meteoric rise in politics coinciding with the struggle that is Kenya. And now that he's reached at the pinnacle of power, he must understand that his believability may not be the same. Because initially, Kenyans would say, okay, let's give you a chance because you've been deputy, you've been minister. But you seem to have the energy, you seem to have the ideas. Now he has nowhere to look for. We're looking at him to fix this country, and fix it he must within the rule of law and making sure that all of us are feeling his empathy and all of us are feeling that he's compassionate. And it is not about you, Excellency, being the best. It is about making all of us better.
Thank you. Yes, Advocate, the final word before I sample the feedback.
Yes, I think we are in a difficult place, and the crisis we are in requires all voices. And one of my concerns now is that we're going to get to a point where there can only be one voice. You know, we need voices, even the challenge that which. For example, let's take the ongoing
Gen Z
demonstrations. It is important, if we're going to move forward, we also need to be able to say, are there challenges in that process that we also need to look at and that can make us a better country, that can make us a better protest nation, that does not allow for the opportunity of those that would love chaos and who benefit from chaos to then utilize what are legitimate processes to then make already a bad situation worse. Number two is that we need to be very careful about some of the solutions we are proposing. Some of them look very good, on paper, and they're very exciting. But sometimes they're not necessarily good for the nation. By the way, it's very easy for us to have a problem with the offices of First Lady. But these offices exist in a culture. If you are to have a visiting delegation in this country and you don't have that office, we also look, so we need to separate between what is a problem, because some of these things, they are not really fundamental problems. It is possible to actually have some of these offices without necessarily them being a strain on the public purse. When it comes to certain other fundamental questions like the issues that we talked about, hubris, and opulence. Those things are so fundamental that those are the sorts of things that need to stop today, not tomorrow. So basically what we are saying is that we have a very difficult season, but we need to create an environment in which we can have a conversation. And certain actions, including what we've talked about, hubris, including the need for significant government shake-up, that says we are moving a different direction. That needs to happen today if we're going to regain trust.
Thank you. Let's now sample the feedback. The hashtag on X is Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya, and at Ayub Abdikadir. Here is what you are saying on X. And the first one from Sawe says the Kenya Kwanza government still doesn't get it. Kenyans are fed up and awake. The president overpromised and underdelivered with lies. Despite giving him time, his words only worsen the situation. It feels like a one-man show. He needs to start listening more. Babu Michael says this revolt was long overdue. The KK government just triggered it by the Finance Bill 2024. The wrong and the oppressing decisions they make show no future for the youth. Corruption is at its top. Stones are being sold to farmers and no one accounts. Godi Barasawere says the president should ensure that the pledge he gave on upholding the rule of law, fighting corruption and getting rid of incompetent officers in his administration is effected. These are the steps that will minimize cacophony in government. Sagire says, why church bishops hijacking the dialogue thing? The church is the main reason why Gen Z feel this dialogue isn't genuine, because the bishops want to seize the opportunity to make cash. The bishops never protested. Please stay away. Gabi Wakasiaka says, in yesterday's interview, President Ruto highlighted ambitious economic plans but fell short on specifics about implementation. Vague promises won't address Kenya's urgent needs. It's time for concrete action and accountability, not just rhetoric. Remy Butia says, for now, Kenya's leaders need cooler heads. Sit down to thrash out a solution. The president will have to swallow a large slice of humble pie to do this. This will prove a stunt test of leadership. Gentlemen, your time is all appreciated. You had a final word, please. 30 seconds. I am absolutely out of time. These gentlemen will kick me out of the studio.
The final word is to say that the president needs to do something around his cabinet. He may fire all of it, fire some of them, but some of them who are corrupt and incompetent needs to go as a sign of goodwill to the protesters. Thank you very much. Franklin
Mukwanja is the Executive Director, the Center for Multi-Party Democracy. Advocate Kamodo Waiganjo, formerly the Commissioner at the Constitution Implementation Committee, and Reverend Canon Chris Kinyanjui, the Secgen of the National Council of Churches of Kenya. Gentlemen, thank you for your time here on the broadcast. Much appreciated for your company. And thanks to you too. Isaac Swila and his team is up next with Sporty Monday. Thanks for waking up with us, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at the same time here on the broadcast. Till then, good morning.